and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassidy Cash. When we think about Shakespeare and his plays, we rarely think of good old England as being a place where people had handguns. We think of handguns in like the modern adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, where Leonardo DiCaprio is running through the streets with a handgun, and certainly Mercutio in that film was handgun happy. And they fought with guns instead of with swords. And we don't really think of William Shakespeare's lifetime as having had those, but it turns out that during the 16th century and the reign of Queen Elizabeth I precisely, saw the old standard for England's army, the longbow, actually get replaced by a new and more modern weapons called the firearm. Guns are mentioned specifically in several of Shakespeare's plays, including Romeo and Juliet, Henry VI Part 2, Love's Labour's Lost, All's Well That Ends Well, The Tempest, and the poem Venus and Adonis, which is why we're kicking off our series on weapons this month by asking the question, did Shakespeare have a handgun? From the poem Venus and Adonis, Shakespeare says, quote, even as the wind is hushed before it raineth, or as the wolf doth grin before he barketh, or as the berry breaks before it staineth, or like the deadly bullet of a gun, his meaning struck her ere his words begun. And this is a powerful line from Venus and Adonis, and it not only strikes fear into the heart about the meaning behind the poem, but it gives evidence that William Shakespeare understood not only guns, but that they were fired with bullets and how that all functioned. Both of these attributes were new, historically speaking, to England. So let's take a look at exactly what the guns were for Shakespeare's lifetime. There were actually the development of handguns, and specifically the pistol, during the 16th century in England. The English word for pistol actually comes from the French word pistolet and was introduced in England around 1570. Now that's the word. The handgun has existed a long time before this, but it starts gaining in popularity in England during the 16th century, and the word pistol itself comes into the English language during the 1570s. To introduce you to guns in Shakespeare's England, here are 5 kinds of handguns that were used in England when Shakespeare was alive. And of course, we have to include references to them from Shakespeare's plays, so I'm going to share with you a quote from Shakespeare's play that I've matched up with each of these 5 handguns just because I think that that's fabulous. From Henry VI Part 2, Shakespeare says, or like an overcharged gun, recoil and turn the force of them upon thyself. One kind of gun he could be talking about there is the matchlock. The matchlock was the first mechanism invented to facilitate the firing of a handheld firearm. You have the European matchlock gun, which held a slow-burning match in a clamp at the end of a curved lever that was known as a serpentine. When you pulled the lever, it's like pulling a trigger, and it would actually become the trigger mechanism in later versions of this gun. It was connected to the serpentine, so the clamp would drop down and lower the smoldering match onto a flash pan that held the powder, and it would explode. This would light it on fire and create the propellant that launched the bullet out of the gun barrel. Now, at the time, there weren't like standardized bullets. A lot of times soldiers would even have to make their own bullets. And so there were different sizes. The idea of standardizing the size of gun would be developed later. But once you let go of the lever or the trigger, the spring-loaded serpentine would move in reverse to clear the pan, and the match would then be removed before you reloaded the gun. Both ends of the match were usually kept lit in case one actually went out. You would still be able to fire the gun. So there's one origin of the idea of burning a candle at both ends or burning a match at both ends. Those can be gun references. And we picked our quote from Henry VI Part 2 to go along with the matchlock because when you let go of the lever, it actually does move in reverse or recoil. Our next quote from Shakespeare comes from Love's Labour's Lost, Act 3, Scene 1, where Shakespeare writes, "Is that lead slow which is fired from a gun?" We've paired this up with the second of our guns from Shakespeare's lifetime, and that is the wheel lock. The wheel lock was the advancement from the matchlock. It was the next stage or phase, however you want to call that, but it was also a self-igniting firearm. So basically with the wheel lock, when you pulled the trigger, the steel rotating wheel came in contact with the pyrite, created the sparks, which ignited the gunpowder in the flash pan and launched the bullet out of the gun. Interestingly, a modern comparison for how the wheel locked work is the way that a cigarette lighter works, where you kind of rotate the wheel and it creates a spark. That's the same kind of movement that a wheel lock would have used. The wheel lock wasn't a very practical weapon. It was complex to make and complex to use, and was also very expensive to produce. A quote from Troilus and Cressida brings us to our third kind of gun that was available in Shakespeare's lifetime, when Shakespeare writes, "There were wit in this head, and 'twould out, and so there is, but it lies as coldly in him as fire in a flint, which will not show without knocking." That comes from Troilus and Cressida, Act 3, Scene 3. Our third kind of gun in Shakespeare's lifetime is a flintlock. A flintlock is a general term for any kind of firearm that used flint as its firing mechanism. So the basic premise of a gun here is that there's gunpowder and it gets ignited by a flash, and that creates a mini explosion inside the gun that launches a propellant out of the gun. That's the basic premise of a gun. For the wheel lock, we talked about it being ignited by steel on pyrite. In a flintlock gun, the ignition process happens with a piece of flint. But it doesn't have to apply to a particular style of gun. If you look at different kinds of flintlock guns over the years, they are designed differently. But if they use a piece of flint, they are a flintlock gun. This gun came to England in the early 17th century. So right at the end of William Shakespeare's life is when this one would have been coming in and replacing the matchlock and the wheel lock. Interestingly, if you're trying to stage a historical production of something like William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which was written in the 16th century, you'll notice that it probably wasn't the flintlock gun that's being referenced by Romeo in that play. Flintlock weapons were mainly self-defense weapons, making it another good choice for the streets of London, which were often scary places. But it was also used as a military weapon, but it was a short-range weapon, so you couldn't shoot a long way away. It would be used in person-to-person combat. The next quote comes from The Tempest, Act 2. "All things in common nature should produce without sweat or endeavor. Treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine, would I not have. But nature should bring forth of its own kind all poison, all abundance, to feed my innocent people." Our fourth kind of gun during Shakespeare's lifetime that should have been produced without sweat or endeavor is the harquebuses. I have no idea if I'm saying that correctly or not. There is actually another term for it called the arquebus, and that's what I'm going to call it for today. But there's two terms, and I'll spell it for you on the screen here. But it was a kind of long gun. So it is actually handheld. You know, you're shooting like this, well, to your shoulder. I'm holding my hands up so you can see, but you know, aiming like a gun, a long gun. You've seen this and heard of this. It first appeared in Europe in the 15th century, but the term arquebus seems to apply to a lot of different kinds of guns that appeared between the 15th and 17th century. So when I say that the arquebus was popular during Shakespeare's lifetime, there's a lot of different kinds of arquebuses that term applies to. But the definition is, quote, "a handgun with a hook-like projection or lug on its undersurface, useful for steadying it against battlements or other objects when firing." They were also called hook guns, in addition to being called arquebuses, which is probably linguistically where the H gets thrown in there, but I'm not going to go into a linguistic exploration. What they do have is technology developed for the crossbow that was applied to this long gun. So specifically, the ability to rest it against your shoulder is what the arquebus was known for. And there was actually a matchlock mechanism applied to the arquebus, so you could have one form of it where you can rest it on your shoulder and it fires using the matchlock mechanism that was from the matchlock we talked about earlier. The arquebus would go on to be developed into a particular kind called the musket. So a heavy arquebus was known as a musket. And that is our fifth kind of gun that was around in Shakespeare's lifetime. From All's Well That Ends Well, Shakespeare writes, that drive thee from the sportive court where thou wast shot at with fair eyes to be the mark of smoky muskets. I'm probably putting the emphasis on the wrong places there, but you get the point. Shakespeare knew what a musket was. A musket would eventually develop into what we know as the rifle from the 19th century, but during the siege of Parma in 1521, Spanish soldiers are reported to have used, quote, an arquebus with a rest. And it was a weapon much larger and powerful than the regular arquebus, and would go on to become known as the musket. It was a long-barreled musket caliber weapon that was used to defend large walls or fortresses, to like fire down or out. If you've seen those walls with the narrow windows to shoot out of, the musket would have been useful there as well. It's not entirely clear what the distinctive differences are between a musket and an arquebus, and actually in several historical accounts, those terms get used interchangeably. So when you're reading about them, an arquebus might not necessarily be a musket, but all muskets are arquebus. They were originally used as sporting weapons instead of military weapons, but we do know that by 1611, they were present in the military warfare of Denmark. So at some point, they made the transition from a sporting weapon into something that would be used by the military. These are just a few of the examples of the kinds of guns that were available in William Shakespeare's lifetime and that was being used when he was writing these famous lines from his plays. I hope this helped you explore a piece of Shakespeare's life. I'm Cassidy Cash, and that's it for this week. I hope you learned something new about the Bard. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.